there was a very large Jewish community in Spain, but they lived in the Muslim section of Spain, in Granada mostly. When Spain was united, the Arabs were thrown out, the Muslims were thrown out of Spain, but the Portuguese Jews were not. I mean, the Spanish Jews at that time were not. But at first they were allowed to continue business because they were, quite a few of them were businessmen. And then afterwards, Isabella in particular became a little stricter and wanted them to conform. So they became conversos, they called them, and they would become Catholic in name, but continue a lot of the Jewish traditions. Eventually, it got even stricter, and a lot of them fled to Portugal. And they were called New Christians because they were Christian, but mostly in name. They continued a lot of their Jewish traditions. They then went to Portugal, and for quite a few years were living quite well in Portugal until the king of Portugal decided he wanted to marry Isabella and Ferdinand's daughter, the Infanta, who was a very strict Catholic. And she was not having any of these conversos, not following the, they must not only do it in name, they must actually do it. So at that point, a lot of Portuguese Jews, and these are all Sephardic Jews, the whole Sephardic tradition in the Jewish community is all Spanish and Portuguese Jews. They then went to Holland. And from Holland, there was in the 1600s, the first Jewish settlement in the Americas, North and South, was set up in Suriname, Up the river, there was a large community of Sephardic Jews that started there 1630s. Early on, and it was quite a large community, so much so that they also had a synagogue in Paramaribo and a large synagogue further up the river. I didn't know about all of this until I went to Suriname and I went to visit Jordan Savan, which is the Jewish community up the river. And there's an enormous cemetery, I would say at least 500 tombstones that are lying flat on the ground. These black marble tombstones that they brought from Holland. After they died, they would get these tombstones from Holland. And I was very surprised at the names. There were so many De Souzas, De Freitas, De Costa, Fernandes, all of these names, but a lot of DEs. I was looking to see if I could find a Dekiris. I don't think I looked at enough names, but I'm sure it's probably there somewhere. But I didn't find it. And I was like, but wait a minute, what is this? And so I started to check into it. And I discovered that the Pomeroon settlement was also originally settled. So there were two waves of Portuguese that came to Guyana. The first wave that actually came not as laborers, but as immigrants, as settlers. And there was quite a few of them in the Pomeroon, and also in the 1600s, when the Dutch lost their possessions in Brazil, in Pernambuco, in Bahia, and that whole area, quite a few of those Portuguese, who were mostly Jews, also came to the Guyanas, to Paramaribo, which already had a Jewish community, and also to Guyana, mostly in the Pomeroon area, because one of the things that the Dutch West India Company wanted to do was to trade with Spanish America and Portuguese America. And so their bright idea was to set up these colonies and settlements in the Pomeroon that could open trade, and the Moruca area open trade with Spanish Guyana, which of course at that time was the Orinoco, because originally there were 5 Guyanas. There was Spanish Guyana, which was the Orinoco area, British, Dutch, French, and Portuguese Guyana on the other end, between the mouth of the Amazon and French Guyana. That became part of Brazil. Spanish Guyana became part of Venezuela. But these settlements were attacked by French pirates a couple of times, and it kind of decimated, and then they came back and they rebuilt the settlement, and it was attacked again. But they continued because Gravesande mentioned in quite a few of his dispatches Jewish settlers that were up the Cayuni. Also, there was a fort all the way up the Cayuni, because his papers are very interesting. When the British were dealing with the whole boundary position thing, they took all of Gravesande's papers and translated them into English to use as proof. And they're available. And he mentions quite a few Jews. So there was that whole Jewish tradition, Jewish Portuguese tradition throughout Guyana, in quite a few places, especially in the Pomeroon and Essequibo area. Later, Demerara, remember, even when Gravesande started Demerara, there were always more British plantations than Dutch. And even so, when it was the uprising in 1763 in Berbice, it was the British sending troops from Barbados that helped to secure Demerara, even though Demerara was still Dutch at that time. It was more British than anything. So it was a natural progression in 1803 to become, when they finally became British. But that tradition, seeing that whole Jewish tradition was never acknowledged, but was quite strong. But I remember growing up in Georgetown and realizing there was never any, I never knew of a synagogue anywhere in Guyana. I later discovered that the Ramsahoy house on Church Street, Dr. Ramsahoy's house, was used as a synagogue on Saturdays. It was not an official synagogue, but the house was used. In particular, the veranda area along Cumming Street was used as a synagogue on Saturdays. But other than that, and I do believe Buldemel is a Jewish honey cake.
That's fascinating. I think what's really interesting is I have been sort of aware of this Jewish history, but no one seems to know anything about it, but you can see it. I mean, like if you're living, when we were living in the Pomeroon, and I was very new to the Pomeroon, and everything was so exciting. And I remember this fisherman coming by, and he was selling no-scale fish. And being in my English way, not understanding anything, I thought he just meant is a fish with that he had descaled. I just thought it was like a Guyanese way of saying, oh, he'd descaled the fish. So I was so excited, and I said, oh yes, I'll buy you no scale fish, and I bought it all up, and I took it back into the house, and I was like, look, I got some nice fresh fish from the fisherman. And Auntie June looked at it and she said, girl, is what a no-scale fish? That's an ungodly fish. And she was so upset. And in the end, the dogs were happy because the dogs got to eat the no-scale fish. But
Caras. Caras and Gail Bacco.
Yes.
Catfish.
That must have come from a sort of Jewish background, because nobody in the Pomeroon likes to eat, no scale fish,
In growing up in my house, now that you mentioned that, we never ate skin fish either. We never ate gilbaka and all of that. It was always scale fish.
Yeah.
And there you go. I learned something else again, you see.
But there must be sort of retentions that we're not really aware of.
Yes. There's a lot of traditions like that throughout the Portuguese community. They don't know where it has come from.
Yeah.
But yes, I mean, they just do it because that's how it's done. Their grandparents did it and their parents did it and they do it,
Yeah. And it's interesting because Rod's family, he's always, because his mother's a Stahl and his father's side are Westmouths, and of course they've always known of their Dutch ancestry. But when he did his DNA test, he had this Port Iberian DNA was showing up, And he also had heard that the first Westmas that arrived was Jewish. So we're assuming now that it must be one of these earlier settlers rather than a, rather than a
Exactly.
settler that came through in the 1800s.
Exactly. And there were quite a few like that. There's actually a Jewish synagogue called I got to look it up, the Esnoga in Amsterdam, that's part of this whole tradition, because and it was a lot of Jewish Dutch settlers that came because they felt that they would be able to trade with with Spanish and Portuguese America, and in particular settled in that Pomeroon area because, of course, it was closer to Spanish Guyana at that time.
Yeah. So,
Mhm.
the other thing I wasn't clear on. So, when the early group of Portuguese came, what were they actually trading in? I mean, do you know what they were?
There were settlers. There were settlers. And it was funny because I've actually I do rum tours. So I'm very interested in the whole history of rum and all of that, because, we in Guyana have by far the best rum in the world. And one of the things that I was looking at was the early connections. And I found that the Portuguese Jews were very much connected, both from Madeira, but also from Brazil. Because what the Portuguese Jews were doing in Brazil before they were, expelled, was growing sugarcane and starting to produce rum. And in those days, of course, it was called kiltum by the Dutch. But they brought that tradition when they fled from, well, they were expelled and left Brazil. And quite a few of them went to Suriname, but also to Guyana. They brought that sugarcane production and how to grow sugarcane, and that knowledge of growing sugarcane and making rum was really because the finance in Suriname, in Paramaribo, one of the biggest businesses is the finance, and they're all Jewish. And it makes me wonder if the finance in Guyana were also Jewish. There must be some connection. But they were very involved in the whole sugarcane growing and rum production and the early days of making rum and all of that. And that tradition was a Portuguese Jewish tradition, which I found, wow, maybe that's why I'm so interested in the rum.
I think that's just a Guyanese thing. I don't know.
I know, I know. I
But
know.
Salvador, I think that's really interesting because when I think of, for example, in Ghana, the castles along the coast. So one of the earliest castles was Elmina, and that was set up by the Portuguese. And I believe the Portuguese were involved. Well, they were the first people to be involved in slavery or enslaving people, as far as I know, even before the Dutch. I mean, I'm just wondering if those early enslavers did they end up mixing with the Dutch? And because I think we're looking at about maybe the mid to late 1600s before the you have the enslaved Africans being brought into Guyana.
No, when they were coming, the Dutch were already involved to some extent, because when they were coming as settlers, if they were able to buy, they were not encouraged to bring their own servants with them from Holland.
Who, the Dutch? Okay, yeah.
These were the Dutch Jews, particularly settling in the Pomeroon. There
I
was
see.
quite a few boatloads of them that came straight into the Pomeroon and offloaded there. But when they came, they were not encouraged to bring their own servants. These were well-to-do people that had businesses and so on. They were investing. They were settlers. They weren't, coming as indentured laborers.
No.
And when they got here, if they could buy 2 slaves with cash, they were then given credit to buy 2 more.
Right.
And so they all had slaves. They all had slaves on the plantations. I mean, yes, right from the beginning. So by 1640s, there are actually, documents that show that they actually had slaves and everything by then already.
Yeah. Okay, that's really interesting. And I guess that they would have intermarried, the Portuguese and Dutch and probably the
Well,
Amerindian community to an extent.
even to go back, what I found also very interesting, the same thing I'm looking at, because I'm very interested in, because they didn't have wives, and the Jewish tradition, all your inheritance and everything goes through the woman, not the man, which makes sense to me. But because you could tell, your father could be anybody, but your mother is your mother. In Suriname and Jordan Savan, there are two cemeteries. There's the one cemetery on one side that's the Jewish cemetery, but because they didn't have enough wives, a lot of them would marry their slaves, and they would be freed and they would become their wife. And they had a separate cemetery across the road. And they didn't have marble slabs on the ground. They had wooden things, which a lot of cases have fallen apart. But all of those descendants, for example, at the synagogue in Paramaribo, which I must also mention, that the synagogue in Paramaribo has a sand floor. And it's one of 5 synagogues in this area that has sand floors. Part of the reason for that, of course, is during the Inquisition, they couldn't listen at the door and tell how many people were inside. But it was also a fire hazard, because on the day what had happened to the synagogue in Paramaribo, one of the original synagogues, was a candle had fallen over, but you're not allowed to do anything. It's a day of rest. On the Sabbath, you're not allowed to do anything, and they were not allowed to pick up this. You couldn't pick up the candle and put it upright. And the synagogue burned down. So even in the roof of the synagogue in Paramaribo, but that's absolutely incredible. And anybody goes to Paramaribo, you need to go and check it out. Where the roof is flat, there's a foot of sand above that in the ceiling. So if there is ever a fire again, when the wood burns, the sand would come down and put the fire out. And there are 5 synagogues like that. There's the one in Paramaribo, of course, that's the oldest. And then there's Tobago, Curacao, St. Thomas, and Jamaica. Those are the 5 sand floor synagogues that, again, I find very interesting, because a lot of the Pomeroon Jews, after they were attacked the second time, quite a few of them fled to Tobago and also to Suriname.
Wow, it's so fascinating. I mean, I've been to see the synagogue in Paramaribo.
Yes.
Yeah, and what I thought was great was it was next door to the mosque, and
Yes.
the rabbi was sitting outside with his cup of coffee, and apparently he'd go open, he'd invite the imam, and I just thought, this was in the middle of like terrorism. I think this was like 2013 or something. And there, one space in the world where Jewish and Muslim people were sitting together. And,
yes, they're very close. They're very close. Actually, when they first built, we were going for a Muslim tourism conference, actually, in Paramaribo, that Guyana was invited to, and we were part of the Guyana delegation. And then the guy who I think was from Mauritania found out that 2 of the members of the Guyana delegation were Jewish. My wife, and also the Anne from Dagron Tours from the Essequibo from Sloth Island, her husband is actually Israeli. And they were also part of the delegation, and they objected to this. And Guyana delegation, I must say, stood up and said, absolutely not. We do not discriminate. We are not, and if they cannot go, the Guyana delegation will not be going, which I thought was wonderful. But the Minister of Tourism immediately jumped in and said, no, we in Paramaribo, we do not do this. We are known for our synagogue next to the mosque. So when we went, we paid a visit to the mosque and to the synagogue. And in the mosque, the Imam was explaining to us that when they were building the mosque, the floor at one point collapsed. And it was Mr. Finance, one of the prominent members of the synagogue next door, that provided a loan and provided money for them to build their floor and treat. So he says, you know, these guys across there and pointing through the window, they're our brothers.
Yeah.
There's no difference between us, you know. And yes, religion and all of that, but show me in the Quran where it says that they are not, you know, that the Jews are not, we are not supposed to be friends with them or anything like that. Show me.
Yeah.
And this guy from Mauritania and these are a couple of other people that were on the delegation, Indonesia and so on, said, no, it's true, there's no way. And he said, no, they are our brothers, and that's how it is. And it's wonderful to see. And it's even during the war, the Muslims helped a lot of the Jewish people escaping from Europe at that time. They provided homes and help and everything. And when they went to pay back for their floor, Mr. Finance refused to take the money, and he said, absolutely not, it's yours.
Well, I have to say that's a wonderful story, and you know, we need a bit more of that in life, I think.
Yes, yes.
Thanks for sharing that. I think I'm going to round up there. We're going to have a Q&A afterwards, so I've got lots of questions in my head, but I just want to make sure we get everybody in. And while you're on, I'll just mention that Wayne McWatt, if people haven't noticed, has put in the chat an amazing photograph of the of Paramaribo, you know, with the mosque and the synagogue together. It's a stunning photograph, so have a look at it in the chat. And there's a lot of conversation going on there, which is great to see. But yes, thank you so much, Salvador, and
no problem.
Lots of thanks from me and the audience. Perfect. I'm going to move now to Bruce. Let me see if I can find Bruce. Bruce Norbriga, where are you? Somewhere. Here